Hello, everybody. It's a Cloud Security Alliance UK chapter event. This event is sponsored by XM Cyber. We've brought and carefully selected XM Cyber as a vendor that can add useful information to and capabilities to cloud users in the UK and worldwide as well. This session is the first one in the series with XM Cyber. It's an introduction session. And we have a VP Product, Menachem Sharam from XM Cyber. Welcome, Menachem.
Hi, welcome. Thank you, Vladimir. So first, it's a pleasure to be here. And let's start. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let me know if you can actually see.
I will add it to the stream, and I will remove myself so you can all focus on the presentation. Enjoy the ride. And sorry, probably before I go, at the bottom you can see the Slido URL. We will be putting activating polls throughout the event. We've got 2 polls, and it would be great to get your interaction. Of course, you can also ask the questions on the YouTube stream in the comments. Thank you, and let's go.
Okay, excellent. So basically, when I came to prepare this talk, I started to look for different type of breaches that are involving the cloud. So we all are aware of a few very notable breaches, such as the Capital One breach and a few other breaches that were cloud security related in general. But I was asking myself how common it is actually, and going over different breaches, and we're hearing of breaches all the time. You see that you usually don't hear are those breaches involving cloud assets or not. But luckily, last week, I got a very interesting statistics. Verizon published their data breach investigation report for 2021. And one of the things that they mentioned on that report was that basically 146 of 171 breaches that were listed there were targeting cloud assets. So we are starting to get the statistics that cloud assets are being targeted by attackers. This is not just a theoretical game. Yet, the more interesting statistics that they mentioned was that actually for 4,684 breaches that they recorded in this report, didn't have any classification of whether they are involving enterprise entities or cloud entities. And I think that this is actually the key thing. The key thing is that those breaches today that involving cloud are so common that in most cases people don't mention that the breach involved the cloud, didn't involve the cloud, it was a breach to a company. And you can assume that because of the wide adaptation of cloud technology, that it did involve cloud assets in some cases. So the next thing I started to ask myself was basically, when we're talking about cloud security and we realize there are breaches, is it actually something that is different from regular security? I mean, we don't have dedicated security teams for Active Directory security or for file share permissions security. So why is cloud different, or is it actually different? So we all know the funny memes about that there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer, or it's just basically Linux server that is someone hosted somewhere else. So obviously we all know that that's not accurate, but it's an interesting question of when we're actually looking at cloud security, do we need to treat it differently than other types of security? So the first thing I noticed was that basically if we're looking in the industry, we can see that, for example, IBM in their cost of data breach report, actually they see cloud as something different. They decided to classify it. You see that there are misconfigurations that are creating breaches, but they have a dedicated section for cloud misconfigurations. And almost 20% of the breaches that they analyzed, the root cause was due to a cloud misconfiguration. Furthermore, they're mentioning that breaches that involved cloud misconfiguration basically had an average of over 14% higher cost for the organization suffering the breach. So basically, that is telling us, indicating that basically, maybe we do need to look at cloud security as something different. The breaches are costing more, and so forth. Now, before I'm going to my next slide, I would like to ask a poll, the first one, and basically ask, in your organizations, how are people actually, who is actually responsible for cloud security? Is it a dedicated cloud security team? Is it the regular security operations team, or something else? Okay, so
Well, yeah, the poll is active. We'll see how people are voting, but I would suggest let's go further, and I will call the results as they are coming.
Okay, excellent. So before actually seeing your results, it is interesting that the Cloud Security Alliance actually had a survey recently, and one of the things that they've asked is who's actually responsible for cloud security. And we see that while in 35% of the response were that the security operations, but in 18%, which is the second highest, we've seen that the cloud team, and this is something that we in XM Cyber, we see in a lot of situations. We see that there are organizations where cloud security is part of the security operations, and sometimes there's a cloud operation team that is responsible for both the operations of the cloud, but also for the cloud security, and they're a separated entity responsible for cloud adaptation. And this is actually something that I feel is actually very, very interesting, because, well, it does make sense in some ways. It makes sense because when you look at it, techniques in cloud attacks, they're actually different than attack techniques for the enterprise environment. We see in enterprise environment, XM Cyber is running into domain credential issues, outdated software, and many more different types of vulnerabilities. Yet when you're looking at cloud attack techniques, you're basically seeing identity and access management, identity and access management, identity and access management. Now, I would mention that obviously there are some vulnerabilities. You might deploy on a server a software and you fail to patch it and things of that nature. And there are other things, but really most of the issues are related to IAM management issues and so forth. And that makes sense because the cloud is providing you with a lot of agility on how you're actually configuring, a lot of attack surface from the complex nature of the IAM. And on the other hand, the cloud providers are taking care of many of the traditional things that you had to take care of, such as updating databases and things of that nature. You're using a database as a service. The cloud provider is actually patching them. And there is actually a very interesting quote by Scott Piper, which is one of the leading security researchers for AWS. And they're basically he's mentioning that there are almost 6,000 privileges in AWS, and 42% of them do not have conditions restrictions. So basically, you cannot actually restrict them and put and fine tune. You either give the entire permission or not, making it a very complex nature, which basically would make sense that we would treat it differently. We have different people that are responsible for adopting the cloud, making sure it's secure, and so forth. And I don't know, do we have the results from the poll? Did people vote?
Yes, we do have a few votes. Actually, most of the people said it's other.
It's other. Wow.
But we've got a few security operations and a bit more cloud team.
Okay, so it's interesting. I'm curious to hear what are the others, because in most cases that's what I felt that are the people that are doing, but it would be interesting. So the next thing that I was thinking about was that actually we're looking at cloud security, and we're saying, well, it's different from our perspective. It's different technology, we need to learn about it, the attack techniques are different, the technology is different. But from the attacker perspective, we were now talking about our perspective as defenders, but from the attacker perspective, do they also see the cloud as something that is different? Because one of the worst things that we could do is actually try to look at the attacker and try to defend and basically play chess against ourselves without thinking what would the other person do. Only when we start thinking what the attackers do, we can actually learn about the different things that they might do, and we can respond better. So looking at it from the attacker perspective, the first thing that I wanted to mention that actually attacks are not a single step. You don't just reach server and that's your critical asset. Usually we're seeing that attackers, they're landing somewhere in the environment where they find the ability, either from phishing, maybe an exposed internet-facing server with a vulnerability, and different types of techniques, and then they're pivoting towards the critical assets, which is their actual target. And from previous year data breach investigation report by Verizon, we're seeing this nice statistics that actually in most breaches, attack took about five steps for the attacker from the initial breach point until the critical assets. And in many cases, those were actually cloud servers. So last week, the cyber readiness report came out and mentioning that over 30% of the first entry point for a cyber attack is actually were cloud servers. So we're seeing attackers that are starting from the cloud servers, and they might pivot and move around. And actually, this is something that I'm very happy to see in the industry, in the fact that people are actually speaking about it. If you look a few years ago, you can see that in most cases, people say, what was the reason for the breach? It was phishing. What was the reason for the breach? It was a vulnerability. But in reality, we're all aware that when you do incident response, when you analyze breaches, you see attackers are actually working in the environment. In many cases, they're sitting in the environment and pivoting across and learning it for months before being exposed. And we cannot just say, that's the reason. That's why the breach was there. There was this vulnerability. It was a vulnerability, and then the attacker pivoted across the environment. So we're seeing that attackers, they're moving, and we're seeing that they might start in many cases from cloud servers, but not just. If we're taking, for example, the Solarwinds attack that I'm sure you've all heard of, so putting aside how Solarwinds themselves were breached and how the attacker actually infiltrated their CI/CD process, let's look at what the attacker did once it actually leveraged Solarwinds to actually compromise the Orion servers on different enterprise networks. So usually the Orion server is an enterprise, is an on-prem server. And what we've seen that in many of the cases, the attacker pivoted across the enterprise environment until it was able to actually forge golden SAML tickets, which basically allowed him to pivot towards their Azure environment, the Azure AD, and from there continue their pivoting and their movement until they reach different critical assets. So we're seeing here is the case where an attacker started from the enterprise environment and actually worked his way towards the Azure environment. Another interesting thing that actually we've seen with a few of our customers with the attack simulation, and we've seen discussions about this type of happenings in the various security forums. There's a nice write-up from SpectreOps about it, is how attackers are actually moving from the enterprise to Azure environment and then back to the enterprise. So one of the interesting findings that we've seen at one of our customers was basically the XM Cyber started from a random device in the enterprise, due to a domain credential issue, was able to actually pivot to another device that was owned by someone who is actually managing Azure environments. On that machine, we actually were able to find a Azure access token, leverage them to pivot to the cloud, and then pivot until we were actually able to compromise the Intune admin. Once the Intune admin was compromised, we were actually able, the attacker was able to actually execute scripts and compromise a critical asset sitting in the enterprise due to the fact that it was managed by Intune. For those of you who are not aware of what Intune is kind of the next generation SCCM of Microsoft. It's basically a device management platform that is meant to manage both your enterprise on-prem devices as well as devices that are either in the cloud or work from home or bring your own devices, basically manage everything. And one of the abilities is actually to execute maintenance scripts on various machines. So an attacker compromising this Intune application in Azure can actually leverage it to pivot towards different devices, even outside the cloud. So we are actually seeing that the enterprise and the cloud are actually connected, and attackers are also leveraging it in order for them to move and reach their goals. So from that perspective, I might ask myself, maybe we shouldn't just look at it in different silos. I feel that, while obviously there is specialization and people need to learn about how the cloud works in order for them to better protect it, we need to be aware that attackers are not looking at it in that manner. And overall, I feel that in the future we would less and less have people that are in dedicated cloud teams responsible for the cloud security, and there'll be an overall responsibility in the security operations, both for the enterprise environment and for the cloud environment, so that they can look at the bigger picture and understand the risks that are caused between the various environments. So this is what I believe would happen in the following years, in the future, when we would mature more in terms of our security efforts.
Menachem, we have one question from the audience.
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, I'll read it as it is, but I'll also put my context there. So the question is, is the identity the weakest when it comes to lateral movement? What do you think?
So I think that, first, I've heard, I don't remember which industry analyst was saying it, but that in the cloud, identity is everything. I mean, you have a virtual machine, and it is attached to a role, basically to an identity that it's defining what are its permissions. When you have a Lambda function, a serverless function, it is attached to a role that basically is telling it what's the permission. The users are basically given identities that are defining their permission. So basically in the cloud, almost everything is related to identity, and therefore I think that it's the biggest attack surface in the cloud, a lot more than finding different vulnerabilities and things of that nature. You will see in most cases, in most attack paths, that eventually there are a few of the steps will involve misconfigurations of identities, basically what's called IAM privilege escalations. And yes, it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that is there, but definitely identity is the majority of the part in the cloud. Yet I would also say that, I'm talking, and it might sound like I'm saying, this cloud, that's an awful thing, that's bad for security, all of those complex configurations of the identities, and each identity can actually connect to other identities, and all of this big mess. And the way I view it is, I feel that cloud security today is kind of what Active Directory security was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of possibilities, and there's not enough education and experience in the market. Yet, in the cloud, we're seeing that the cloud providers, the vendors, are doing a lot of efforts to help people both educate the market and give abilities to strengthen their security and put a lot more conditions. So the complexity is not just there to confuse us, it's actually to give us the ability to create fine-grained security policies that would actually help us deliver a better security. So if you look at cloud security, I believe that cloud security it can be more secure than the enterprise security, because we're doing things new with all the knowledge that we accumulated from enterprise environments. Yet there's going to be a big learning curve and a lot of education so that people will not make all the possible mistakes that are there. Does that
Yeah, that sounds fair, and I agree. If I may, one more comment to this great picture that you are showing. I'll have a little bit of a step to at Microsoft, just a tiny bit. Microsoft does have the capabilities, typically in their premium products, where you can configure privileged access management, they have Azure P1, P2, which could be some kind of pricey a little bit. They have additional security subscriptions. So first, I think that the Microsoft, in this specific example, they could do better at providing the security feature as a kind of baseline product rather than the premium product. But of course, people still need to configure it and use it correctly. So, for example, in this, what you are showing, if it's correct, if people have licenses and if it's correctly configured on the cloud side, privileged access management, for example, and the conditional access with risk-based authentication, this scenario could have been mitigated.
Yeah, and I feel that in many cases, many of those scenarios can be detected. I feel that we're a lot stronger at detection than on prevention, yet hoping that we'll detect things in time and not in retrospective is always kind of a wishful thinking, I would say. So we need to invest in detection, but we also need to work on our prevention mechanisms. Okay, so that's one of the things, and I thought that we need to think about it more from the attacker perspective and about the fact that the enterprise and the cloud are actually connected. But really, we started to touch about the different techniques and what attackers are doing in the cloud. And I feel that one of the things when we're talking about all those IAM misconfigurations and all of those things is to actually ask ourselves, are cloud attacks techniques really attacks, or is the attacker just doing regular behavior? I mean, if you're looking on the example here, if the attacker reached a device that is owned by someone that is managing the Intune, for example, in Azure, then that machine connecting to Intune and actually executing script is something that could be deemed legitimate. You don't know that that specific script is actually something that is malicious, that is meant to be used by an attacker to actually reach certain critical assets. So that's something that we really need to ask ourselves. And actually, when you're looking at different cloud attack techniques, it's really what we used to call in the enterprise environment living off the land. So if in the enterprise we're saying living off the land, you were using tools that were on the computer. You don't need a dedicated malware with different techniques. You were just using tools that are on the operating system. In the cloud, it's pretty much the same. You're living off the cloud. Attackers are doing things such as reading the user data for the virtual machines, or accessing the metadata service, basically to try to figure out what is the role of that machine and what are its permissions. Basically, they're assuming roles. They're reaching a certain role and then using it in order to assume a different role. And all of those things are things that the cloud providers provide so that the users can actually use them and leverage them. Users are putting secrets in many cases in the user data storage because that's convenient for them, and that's something that is there. They're using the metadata service that's you're not even aware that your virtual machines in the cloud are actually using that service. You're assuming roles as part of your day-to-day routine. So using all of those actions are not necessarily malicious. If we're looking a few weeks ago, HackerOne together with AWS held the capture the flag exercise. And it was very interesting. If you look at the different things that were set up there in order for people to reach the cloud, only the first step, which was an SSRF vulnerability, was an actual malicious behavior, was something that you might say, well, looking at it, that's malicious, that's not intended. All the rest of them was reading roles, accessing secrets that you had permissions to access, leveraging those secrets, things that that are basically legitimate. So looking at those techniques, really, you're always asking yourself, are those actual attacks, and what are we going to do? And the same thing was for the Capital One breach. So here there's an illustration of the Capital One breach. Just as a recap, there was an external attacker. He was actually able to compromise an EC2 in AWS, and he was actually able to use it using an SSRF. That EC2 was a WAF, was a web application firewall, and it had an SSRF vulnerability that basically allowed the attacker to execute code on the EC2. Using that, it was actually querying the metadata service, trying to realize what is this EC2, what are its permissions, realize that it can actually get an SDS token for a different highly permissive role that basically was meant to actually write the logs for the web application firewall, but by mistake was given access to read and write the entire S3 service of that account. So again, if you're looking at what the attacker did, the first step was an SSRF, but querying the metadata service was a legitimate thing, assuming the role was legitimate, and that role was meant to actually access S3 buckets. The only thing was that it wasn't meant to, but it had permissions to access all the S3 buckets, which was part of the issue. So really, it brings us to the question of what we can actually do. Another interesting example that we've actually seen at one of our customers, which is a Fortune 500 bank, was actually a complete account takeover. So they were asking themselves the question, if an attacker would be able to compromise one of our SSO credentials, we have using SSO, people from the enterprise can connect to their AWS environment, and they were asking, what is the risk that it is actually posing to my AWS environment? And what it was able to find was that an attacker that was able to reach one of the low-level SSO roles, basically of almost every developer in the environment, could actually escalate its privileges in 4 easy steps and compromise all of the production EC2s in that account. And the way it actually worked was basically developers can assume a specific developer SSO. That specific role had permission to update and invoke a Lambda function, a serverless function in AWS. Overall, that makes sense. Developers, they need to update that code, and that's reasonable. Yet that Lambda function was actually attached to a role that had permissions to assume other roles in the environment, which one of them was actually a very powerful maintenance role. And that maintenance role had permissions to use the Amazon Systems Manager and basically execute code on the production EC2s. Now, looking at it, each step by its own was legitimate. The developer had permissions to update the Lambda function. The Lambda function role had permission to assume other roles because it doesn't need to be constantly with the high privilege role. And there was a role which was meant for maintenance, which although was powerful, but that was his purpose. And they failed to notice that in both manual audits that they were doing using their CSPM product, and everything seemed legitimate. But only when they actually looked at it on the entire chain of event, on the attack path that could have been created, did they realize the risk that was there and what they need to do in order to mitigate. So to summarize, we can see that basically attacks in the cloud are in many cases things that are not necessarily malicious by definition. And it's very, very hard to actually differentiate, is this something legitimate or is it something that is done by a malicious attacker? So we need to ask ourselves, what can we actually do? How can we actually approach this issue in a manner that would help us fight it? So the first thing that comes to mind, and this analogy is not saying that we need to choose one or the other. We actually probably need to take both pills in this case. But the first thing that comes to mind is doing, anomaly detection, trying to have different types of heuristics and telling us, well, this role was not accessing this API call a long time ago, so maybe that's suspicious. And maybe there's another thing that is happening that is suspicious, that role should not write to this S3 bucket. It only wrote to a different S3 bucket, and different types of things like that. And we're seeing that the cloud providers and other security solutions are providing this kind of tool. We can see Amazon with Guard Duty that is doing different types of machine learning and heuristics to try to detect malicious behaviors. But we know from our experience, we know from years of working with intrusion prevention system, with different anomaly detection mechanisms in enterprise environments, that this is something that it's tedious, it's hard, there's many false positives, there are many alerts that we need to go over and try to figure out, is this really something legitimate or not? And we cannot just rely on those things to actually solve our security problems. We cannot just assume, okay, we'll get an alert of something suspicious, we'll investigate it quickly enough, and if it's a malicious behavior, we will stop it. Usually we're overwhelmed with alerts, we're too busy, and by the time we actually realize that this was actually malicious activity, it is usually too late. So what is the alternative? What the other thing that we can do? And the alternative was basically to try to analyze and build the possible attack graphs, basically the attack path that an attacker can actually take from various places in our environment towards the critical assets, so we can analyze and try to figure out, is this a risk that we're accepting? Is this something that is really needed in order for the operations? Or maybe we can actually build things differently. And to quote John Lambert from Microsoft, and this is actually a quote I think from 5 or 6 years ago, he said, defenders thinks in list. We're always having compliance checklists. Is this fine? Is this fine? Is this fine? Yet attackers are thinking in graphs. They're thinking, where can I pivot next? What can I do? And as long as we're not changing that, the attackers are always going to find the path in order for them to actually reach to their goals. And this is really what we need to do in order to change and be one step ahead of the attackers. Now, before I continue, I would like to take the second poll, the second questions that we have, and basically ask the audience, how often do they actually do audits in their cloud environment? Is it something that is done yearly? Is it something that is done quarterly, monthly, daily? Is it something that they never do? They just, on a ongoing basis, try to notice if something malicious. How does it actually work? So let's give it a few seconds.
The poll is alive. Anybody clicking daily, do get in touch, please. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, definitely.
By the way, on the previous poll, we had about 50-50 split between other and cloud and security operations.
Interesting. I'm wondering if those are people that meant DevSecOps, so the developers are in charge for the security, because that's also something that is common, yet it's sometimes a bit of a different type of responsibility. And interesting. We'll chat about this. Chat about this later.
Yeah. So the results are coming back from few people. We have about 20% yearly, quarterly also 20%, monthly 20%, and never about 40%.
Okay. So yeah. So it is clear, and this is actually pretty much what I expected, and what you also expected when you said if someone is typing daily, contact me, and that makes sense, because auditing in the cloud is actually very hard, and doing it manually is something that is frustrating and is not easy. I mean, this is just a screenshot from a small test environment that we have, and there are many roles, and each role is attached to many different policies, and try to analyze the different policies and figure out what does it actually allow them to do. And that means that they can actually do this action, which means that later on they can actually do other types of things. And it's hard. It's hard enough that actually it is even hard for the cloud provider themselves. So there is actually an interesting blog from I think about a year ago from Scott Piper, again on AWS, where he actually went over and audited managed AWS policies. So obviously we all know AWS provide canned managed policies that are supposed to be like best practices or things that you can start with when you're building your own policies. And what he found out was that actually even on those policies, which AWS is actually managing, he found many different problems, many different vulnerabilities, so to speak, that could allow an attacker, to actually escalate his privileges. And it's very interesting to see the different findings that were there. Now, obviously, AWS is constantly updating and fixing those policies. So it's something that is very hard for people to do. Even if you're AWS themselves and you have all the expertise, you're still making mistakes. You're still needing. It takes you time to find them, and that actually creates a big problem for us, because think about it. You have two options. Either you're using the managed policies, where you might say, well, they might have issues with them, so maybe I'll copy them, and which many people are actually doing. They're copying the managed policy to a manual policy, and then they're stripping it off from things they think that they don't need. But even that's actually sometimes create even more problem, because AWS finds those problems and fixes them over time. And if you have copied down a policy and stripped it down, you might never actually notice that it's containing a risk that you didn't mention. One of the interesting findings, there was, I forgot which service it was. There was some kind of data science service that AWS provides, and in the managed policy, they basically place that you have access to all of the secrets that were meant to run this service. But by mistake, it was actually giving you the ability for anyone that is assuming this role, that are basically all the data scientists that are using this service, to access pretty much all the secrets in the environment. If I'm not mistaken, the way it was that you had the ability to actually read only secrets that are tagged with a relation to that specific service. Yet, you also had the ability to create tags on secrets. So basically, what was the discovery was that anyone could actually go tag every secret that he discovered with the tag of that service, and then he would be able to actually read that secret and leverage it to further move across the environment. So, different things that are actually very hard to identify and notice. And that's why I feel that in reality, you need to move. What we need to see is we need to start bringing tools to the table that would actually help us understand and continuously assess the security posture of our cloud environment. And this is exactly what XM Cyber actually brings to the table. Basically, XM Cyber is running and building in the background continuously attack graphs of possible attack path towards your sets of critical assets, and actually distills this information to help you track and measure your security posture over time and understand where are you facing. Did something change at the moment that creates risk to your environment? And it's actually doing it both in the enterprise and in the cloud environment. So you both can get a high-level dashboard, but also drill down to get an understanding of what you need to do in order to mitigate. So the entire idea is to not just provide you with this big graph of different attack path and tell you to go and try to understand. It's actually to do this meta-analysis on that graph, so you can identify that here in the center there is this choke point. And this choke point is actually the most important thing for you to focus on, because it might not be the most severe problem, but it would give you the best return on investment, so to speak, the best improvement in security posture. Because we are all aware that the environments are constantly changing, and we're never going to fix all the problems that we have. So we need to prioritize. And in many cases, prioritizing is not necessarily by looking at each issue by itself and ranking it. It's looking how they are related. And in many cases, we can actually close a lot of attack path by closing different small issues. And this is kind of the game that I feel that more and more organizations are going to adapt in the market, where they actually go and they figure out, okay, this would be a small thing that I can fix that will give me a good improvement, and basically create this agile remediation process. Today, we're actually seeing many organizations that are coming and they're basically, creating this yearly projects. Next year we're going to buy a new security solution, and using it will implement a different credential management process. And those are big changes, and they're usually very hard. And what we found out that organizations that adapted a more agile remediation process, where they come to their environment, they identify small issues that could help them improve things that, when I'm saying small, I mean small that are easy to fix, yet have big impact. They can actually improve much faster. They can actually make sure that they're on top of things. And this is an illustration, but this is actually from a real case study with one of our customers, that basically when we came to their environment, our system was able to basically reach from almost every point in their environment to 93% of their critical assets. So the situation was not very good, to say the least. And in a few months of working in an agile way, in coming every week, identifying, those are the small tasks for the week, things that are doable. In a few months, they were actually managing to change themselves to a situation where only 7% of the critical assets were at risk, and they were actually a lot safer. And this is what I feel that the market is going to move towards. Going to continuously assess their security posture and find things that we can actually fix easily and quickly. And really, the idea is to help support and accelerate by de-risking digital transformation. And so basically help you expose and manage when new servers are deployed, and making your red teaming more effective with ongoing simulation, allowing red teams to focus on the more, you have our human resources that are most precious resource in the environment. And if we can have a machine that will continuously scan and take a lot of the burden from them and free them to do the more dedicated stuff, that's actually obviously a benefit, and many more. So this is a little bit about where I think the industry will move, and what XM Cyber is actually bringing to the table with that regard. And just before we finish, I thought I would share a small meme that I feel is actually very relevant to what we've spoken about. It's not just about saying different buzzwords. It's actually thinking and working and changing the processes so we can actually improve our security, and not just throw things to the cloud or move it to containers and things of that nature. So if any of you would like to see a demo or have a more detailed session with us, there are details here of our regional sales director in the UK, and she will be happy. Caroline, are you with us? Are you?
Yeah, I am indeed. Thanks for that, Menahem. So yes, hopefully that was useful for everybody. And if anyone does want to see a demonstration or to go into further detail around this, then please do contact me with the details there, and we'd be happy to set something up.
Yeah, and if there are any questions.
Yeah, I will preempt, kind of go through a few questions. But first, so the result of the poll about cloud audits. Most people voted never, about 43%, but yearly 30%, which is not bad actually. Nobody voted daily. So, but surprisingly,
I still have to put it there,
I know. Yeah. But even monthly, monthly cloud audits is quite frequent, unless you have really good tooling that can automate the audit. We had one question from Rowan. What tools would you recommend to help you with this? And I'm assuming Rowan meant fixing the kind of identified issues in those attacks.
So basically, in most of the cases, the issues are basically stripping down unnecessarily permissions, and which is something that basically you just need to go and do. And in some cases, the more dedicated cases, you need to actually think about changing a little bit the architecture. If we're going back to the example I gave from the Fortune 500 bank, each of the services there had needed those. The maintenance will need to run those scripts on the production EC2s, and the developers still need to modify the Lambda function, and basically they needed to change a little bit the architecture of how things are working in order to prevent that. But in terms of auditing and understanding, so obviously XM Cyber is one of those solutions. There are a few open source solutions that are trying to help you identify unused permissions. So there is an open source project by Netflix called RepoKid, if I'm not mistaken, that actually looks at your history and tries to identify permissions that were not used. Obviously, dealing with such projects is something that you definitely I recommend looking at. In many cases, it's a bit complicated, not if you don't have a set of developers that can actually support that. But there are a few open source solutions, and I feel that some things the cloud providers are actually trying to help with and are starting to do more and more. We've seen AWS with the reachability analysis feature that they released recently, and you can see that a few months ago they added an ability to see if an S3 bucket is actually exposed to the internet or not, and they are starting to add different capabilities. Yet I feel there's a long way that we still need to go as a community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a quick question about the multi-cloud. And so most companies use at least two cloud providers, probably AWS, Azure, some Google as well, and of course each of them have its own specialties, good or bad, complications, configurations. It's if you combine it together, it could be a big pile of configuration mess, basically. But of course, my experience, for example, with Azure Security Center is fairly good. They are adding new security features into it, similar to AWS, Event Hub and Guard Duty. What does your product kind of put on top that they don't do, or they maybe won't do?
So first, I think, and I just had earlier today I had a discussion with Microsoft around the Azure security and their plans. So first, I feel that the vendors themselves are actually going to expand and support multi-cloud themselves in the future. And when I'm saying in the future, I believe that in less than a year from now, you will see that AWS security solutions can actually also monitor, obviously with less comprehensive coverage, but AWS will be able to monitor Azure, and Azure will be able to monitor things in AWS and so forth, and also with GCP. I believe that XM Cyber brings to the table two things on top of that. First, it's the fact that we have the ability to connect this both from the different cloud providers and also to the enterprise environment. And the second thing is that we're always looking at it not from trying to detect issues and not trying to detect activities, but actually trying to bring the attacker perspective and actually what are the possibilities. And from the attacker perspective, help you improve your defenses. And on top of that, actually do this kind of help you with building this agile remediation process by identifying those are the choke points. Those are the quick fixes that will give you the biggest value. So I believe that the cloud providers will support other clouds. So if you're working in a multi-cloud environment, you will be able to use Azure security solutions to also cover your AWS security in many cases. Yet I don't feel that and from what I'm discussing with them, they're not planning on trying to bring the attacker perspective and do this graph analysis and identify choke points and things of that nature. So that's something that XM Cyber, I believe, is bringing more uniquely to the table.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. It was really good webinar. I hope audience enjoyed it as well. Of course, the contact details again I'll put on the screen for Caroline in the UK, or of course the XM Cyber website. So thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Menachem. And thank you, everybody who watched this online or will watch it recorded on our YouTube channel and Cloud Security Alliance UK chapter website.
It was a pleasure, and I hope it was educational and helpful for people. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Vladimir.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.